Commander Joseph Rochefort, hunched over his desk in the basement of Pearl Harbor, surrounded by stacks of encrypted Japanese naval communications. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he worked through another seemingly impossible puzzle. It was May 25, 1942, and the war in the Pacific hung in the balance. 6 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy desperately needed a victory against the seemingly unstoppable Imperial Japanese Navy. The breakthrough came at 3 in the morning. Rochefort's team of codebreakers had been working around the clock to decipher the Japanese Navy's J-125 code. And finally, fragments of Admiral Isoroku, Yamamoto's master plan, began to emerge from the static of intercepted radio transmissions. The Japanese were planning something massive, something that would dwarf even Pearl Harbor in its scope and ambition. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton burst into Rochefort's cramped office, his uniform wrinkled from hours of analysis. "Sir, we've got it," he announced breathlessly. "They're calling it Operation Me, and the target is clear. It's Midway Atoll." Yamamoto's strategy was both brilliant and audacious. The architect of Pearl Harbor intended to lure the remaining American Pacific Fleet into a trap by attacking the strategically vital Midway Atoll, a tiny speck of coral and sand, 1,200 miles northwest of Honolulu. The Japanese admiral knew that Admiral Chester Nimitz would have no choice but to defend Midway, as its loss would leave Hawaii vulnerable to invasion and cut America's lifeline across the Pacific. According to historical records from the Naval Intelligence Service archives, Rochefort's team had achieved what many considered impossible. They had penetrated the Japanese naval code deeply enough to reveal not just the target, but the composition of the attacking force and even the approximate timing of the assault. The intercepted messages painted a picture of overwhelming Japanese superiority. Yamamoto was bringing 4 aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Haryu, and Saru, along with their escort of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. This strike force, commanded by Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo, the same man who had led the Pearl Harbor attack, represented the cream of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Against this armada, Nimitz could muster only 3 operational aircraft carriers: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown. Yorktown presented a particular challenge. The carrier had limped back to Pearl Harbor, badly damaged from the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. Navy engineers estimated it would take 3 months to repair her properly, but Nimitz didn't have 3 months. He had perhaps 3 weeks before Yamamoto's fleet arrived at Midway. As dawn broke over Pearl Harbor on May 26th, Nimitz made the decision that would define the Pacific War's turning point. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, despite having intelligence that could be wrong or deliberately planted misinformation, he would commit everything to defending Midway. The codebreakers had given him the greatest gift any commander could ask for: advanced knowledge of his enemy's intentions. Now he had to use that gift wisely. The race against time had begun. While Yamamoto's massive fleet steamed steadily eastward across the Pacific, confident in their numerical superiority and past victories, the Americans worked frantically to prepare for what everyone knew would be the most crucial naval battle in the Pacific theater. The dry dock at Pearl Harbor buzzed with unprecedented activity, as hundreds of workers swarmed over the wounded Yorktown like ants on a carcass. Rear Admiral Frank Fletcher watched from the dock as welders' sparks flew and the sound of hammering echoed across the harbor. What should have been a 3-month repair job had to be completed in 72 hours. Admiral Nimitz stood beside Fletcher, his weathered face grave as he surveyed the organized chaos. "Can she fight, Frank?" he asked quietly. Fletcher nodded grimly. "She float, and she can launch aircraft. That's all we need." The repair crews worked in shifts around the clock, patching holes, replacing damaged steel, and jury-rigging systems that would normally require complete replacement. Chief Petty Officer John Lindsay, who had served on Yorktown for 3 years, directed teams of workers with the precision of a symphony conductor. They reinforced bulkheads with concrete, installed new electrical systems, and somehow managed to restore the carrier's flight operations capability in what naval historians would later call a miracle of American industrial ingenuity. Meanwhile, on Ford Island, the air crews prepared for what many suspected might be their final mission. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the Enterprise's air group commander, gathered his pilots in the squadron ready room. Maps of the Central Pacific covered every available wall surface, with Midway Atoll marked prominently in the center. "Gentlemen," McCluskey began, his voice steady, despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. We're going to stop the Japanese Navy cold. Our intelligence indicates they're bringing everything they've got. For fleet carriers, battleships, the works, we're going to hit them first, hit them hard, and send them to the bottom." The youngest pilot in the room, Ensign George Gay, raised his hand tentatively. "Sir, what are our odds?" McCluskey paused, considering his words carefully. "Ensign, we're Americans. Make our own odds." As reported in contemporary Navy Department communications, the American strategy would rely entirely on timing and surprise. While the Japanese expected to face a desperate piecemeal defense of Midway, they would instead encounter a coordinated ambush. The American carriers would position themselves northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon, while land-based aircraft from Midway itself would conduct initial attacks to locate and weaken the Japanese fleet. On June 1st, Yorktown limped out of Pearl Harbor, her repairs incomplete, but her fighting spirit intact. Enterprise and Hornet had departed earlier, steaming toward a rendezvous point, designated Point Luck, by Nimitz's staff. The irony of the name was not lost on the American commanders. They would indeed need considerable luck to survive what was coming. Lieutenant Colonel Jimmy Doolittle, still recovering from his famous raid on Tokyo 2 months earlier, met with Nimitz one final time before the fleet's departure. "Chester," he said, using the Admiral's first name in the privacy of the command center, "you're betting everything on this intelligence assessment." Nimitz nodded slowly. "Jim, sometimes you have to trust your people completely. Rochefort and his team have never been wrong. If they say Yamamoto's coming to Midway on June 4th, then that's when and where we'll be waiting for him." The final pieces of the American trap were falling into place. As the three carriers steamed westward through increasingly rough seas, their crews prepared for battle with the grim determination of men who understood that the fate of the Pacific, and perhaps the entire war, would be decided in the next few days. At 4:30 in the morning on June 4th, 1942, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of his flagship Akagi. Watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to the first pale light of what would become the most decisive day in naval aviation history, the sea was unusually calm, perfect conditions for launching aircraft from the 4 carriers of his mobile strike force. "Launch the first attack wave," Nagumo ordered crisply. Within minutes, the flight decks of Akagi Kaga Hiryu, K and Soryu erupted in controlled chaos as 108 aircraft, 36 Nakajima Kate bombers, 36 Aichi Valdive bombers, and 36 Mitsubishi Zero fighters roared into the morning sky. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the formation toward Midway Atoll, confident that this would be another easy victory in Japan's string of Pacific conquests. The attack on Midway began at 6:24 a.m. The Japanese bombers swept over the tiny atoll like a steel hurricane, their bombs exploding among the fuel tanks, hangars, and defensive positions scattered across the 2 small islands. Marines manning anti-aircraft guns fired desperately at the diving aircraft, while the few American fighters that managed to get airborne, obsolete. Brewster, Buffaloes, and a handful of Wildcats fought valiantly, but hopelessly, against the superior Zeros. Major Floyd Parks, commanding the Marine Fighter Squadron at Midway, radioed his final transmission as his Buffalo fighter spiraled toward the ocean. "They got me, but I got one of them too." His sacrifice, along with that of his fellow Marines, bought precious time for the American carriers lurking beyond the horizon. But Nagumo's first victory came at a cost he didn't yet realize. As the Japanese strike force returned to their carriers, Lieutenant Tominaga's damaged Kate bomber struggled to stay airborne. The formation leader radioed a message that would prove fatal to Japanese hopes. There is need for a second attack wave. The single transmission set in motion the series of decisions that would doom the Japanese fleet. Nagumo, following standard doctrine, began preparing his reserve aircraft for a second strike on Midway. The problem was that these reserve aircraft had been armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes for use against American ships that his reconnaissance flights had not yet located. According to declassified Japanese naval records, the rearming process was complex and time-consuming. Bombs had to be lowered into the ship's magazines, torpedoes had to be wheeled into position, fuel lines had to be disconnected and reconnected. Most critically, the aircraft would be temporarily vulnerable on the flight decks during this process. At 7:28 a.m., everything changed. A lone Japanese reconnaissance plane finally spotted the American task force. The pilot's excited radio call crackled through the morning air. 10 ships, apparently enemy, bearing 010 degrees, distance 240 miles from Midway. Agamo faced an impossible dilemma. His first strike force was returning from Midway, low on fuel and requiring immediate recovery. His second strike force was in the middle of rearming for another attack on the atoll. And now, somewhere over the horizon, American ships were steaming toward him at full speed. The Japanese admiral made his fateful decision: recover the returning aircraft first, and launch a coordinated attack against the American fleet. It was a reasonable tactical choice that would prove strategically disastrous. As the last Japanese aircraft touched down on Akagi's flight deck at 9:18 a.m., American dive bombers were already climbing toward their attack altitude, unseen and undetected in the scattered clouds above the Pacific. The trap that Admiral Nimitz and Commander Rochefort had so carefully prepared was about to spring shut. Lieutenant Commander Wade. McCluskey gripped the stick of his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber as he searched the empty Pacific below. It was 10:15 a.m., and his fuel gauge showed dangerously low levels. Behind him, 33 other Dauntless bombers from the Enterprise followed in loose formation, their pilots equally concerned about their diminishing fuel supplies. They should have found the Japanese fleet by now. The intelligence estimates had placed the enemy carriers at coordinates that were now showing nothing but empty ocean. McCluskey faced the same terrible choice that had confronted countless naval aviators throughout history: turn back to his own carrier with enough fuel to land safely, or continue searching and risk ditching in the Pacific. "Stay with me, boys." McCluskey radioed to his squadron. "We're going to find those carriers." Unknown to the American air crews, Admiral Nagumo had changed course after recovering his Midway strike force. The Japanese carriers were now 40 miles north of their predicted position, steaming in a tight box formation with their escorting cruisers and destroyers spread in a protective screen around them. At 10:22 a.m., McCluskey spotted a lone Japanese destroyer racing northward, trailing a white wake across the blue Pacific. The ship was the Arashi, which had been delayed after dropping depth charges on the American submarine Nautilus. McCluskey made a decision that would change history. He followed the destroyer's wake like a highway leading directly to the Japanese fleet. 2 minutes later, the 4 Japanese carriers appeared below him like toys arranged on a blue tablecloth. Kagi Kaga, Hiryu, and Soryu steamed in perfect formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft being refueled and rearmed for the planned strike on the American fleet. Fuel lines snaked across the wooden decks, and ammunition was stacked near the aircraft in neat, deadly piles. The timing was perfect, and perfectly disastrous for the Japanese. For the past 20 minutes, American torpedo bombers from all 3 carriers had been attacking Nagumo's fleet at sea level. These brave pilots, flying obsolete Douglas Devastators, had drawn the Japanese fighter cover down to wave-top height. The Zeros were now far below McCluskey's dive bombers, unable to climb quickly enough to interfere with the attack. As documented in official U.S. Navy battle reports, what happened next unfolded with terrible precision in just 6 minutes. McCluskey rolled his Dauntless into a near-vertical dive toward Kaga, the largest of the Japanese carriers. "This is it, boys," he transmitted. "Make it count." The American dive bombers screamed downward through the morning air, their engines howling as they built up speed. Japanese anti-aircraft fire began to fill the sky with black puffs of smoke, but the attack was too sudden and too steep for effective defensive fire. At exactly 10:24 a.m., McCluskey released his 1,000-pound bomb from 1,500 feet above Kaga's flight deck. The armor-piercing weapon punched through the wooden planking and exploded deep in the carrier's hangar, setting off a chain reaction among the fueled and armed aircraft stored below. Best's bomb struck near the carrier's aft elevator, igniting aviation, gasoline, and ammunition that had been carelessly stacked on the flight deck during the rearming operation. The third attack, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie from Yorktown, targeted Soryu. Leslie's bomb hit the carrier's forward flight deck, and within moments the ship was transformed into a floating inferno. In 6 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese fleet carriers, the heart of their naval aviation power, were burning wrecks. The Miracle at 10:24 had reversed the course of the Pacific War in the span of a single dive-bombing attack. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the burning Hiryu, the last surviving Japanese carrier, as flames and smoke billowed from his sister ships across the water. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were clearly doomed. their flight decks twisted ruins of steel and fire. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy was dying before his eyes. "Prepare for immediate launch," Kaku ordered his air operations officer. As the only remaining operational Japanese carrier, Hiryu bore the terrible responsibility of salvaging something from this disaster. If the Americans thought they had won, they would soon learn otherwise. Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi led 18 Valdive bombers and 6 Zero fighters off Hiryu's deck at 10:58 a.m., climbing steadily toward the last known position of the American fleet. Behind him came a second strike of 10 Kate torpedo bombers and 6 more Zeros under Lieutenant Toshio Hashimoto. These 58 aircraft represented the last offensive punch of Nagumo's once mighty fleet. The Japanese pilots found their target at 12:10 p.m., the American carrier Yorktown, still bearing the hasty repairs from her Pearl Harbor refit, steamed in the center of Task Force 17. Her combat air patrol of 6 Wildcat fighters rose to meet the incoming attack, but they were outnumbered and overwhelmed by the desperate Japanese assault. Kobayashi's dive bombers screamed down through the defensive fire, their bombs striking Yorktown's flight deck with devastating accuracy. 3 bombs penetrated the carrier's armored deck, starting fires in the hangar spaces and knocking out several boiler rooms. The ship's speed dropped to 6 knots as damage control parties fought to contain the destruction. Captain Elliot Buckmaster watched his ship's casualties mount as corpsmen carried wounded sailors to the hastily established medical stations. "Can we maintain flight operations?" he asked his air operations officer. "Negative, sir. Flight deck is inoperable, and we've lost power to the elevators." The second Japanese attack arrived at 2:45 p.m. Hashimoto's torpedo bombers skimmed across the wave tops, their deadly fish aimed at Yorktown's waterline. Despite the concentrated fire from every gun in the task force, 2 torpedoes found their mark. The carrier lurched violently to port as thousands of tons of seawater flooded her lower compartments. But the Japanese success came at a terrible price. American fighters and anti-aircraft fire had shot down most of the attacking aircraft. Of the 58 planes that had launched from Hiryu, only 5 returned to their carrier. The cream of Japanese naval aviation was being systematically destroyed in these desperate attacks. As referenced in Admiral Nimitz's post-battle report to the Navy Department, the American response was swift and decisive. Enterprise and Hornet had been tracking Hiryu through radio intercepts, and by 4:30 p.m., 24 Dauntless dive bombers were climbing toward attack altitude. Lieutenant Wilmer Gallagher, leading the Enterprise bombers, spotted Hiryu at 5:05 p.m. The Japanese carrier was steaming frantically in a tight circle, trying to avoid the inevitable. But there was nowhere to run on the vast Pacific, and no friendly airports within 1,000 miles. "Target the flight deck amidships," Gallagher radioed to his squadrons. "Let's finish this." American dive bombers attacked in textbook formation, their bombs striking Hiryu's flight deck with methodical precision. For direct hits, transformed the last Japanese carrier into a burning wreck within minutes. Captain Kaku, following the ancient code of Bushido, chose to go down with his ship rather than face the dishonor of surrender. By sunset on June 4th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers were either sunk or sinking. The mobile strike force that had terrorized the Pacific for 6 months had been effectively destroyed in a single day. The rising sun was setting on Japanese naval supremacy, and Admiral Yamamoto's dream of decisive victory had become an irreversible nightmare. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood alone on the bridge of his flagship Yamato, the world's largest battleship, as the reality of the disaster at Midway became clear. Radio reports from the burning carriers painted a picture of total catastrophe. In a single day, Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, most of their experienced pilots, and their best chance of forcing the United States into a negotiated peace. The architect of Pearl Harbor faced the most difficult decision of his naval career. Behind him steamed the most powerful surface fleet ever assembled, 11 battleships, including the mighty Yamato and her sister ship Musashi, along with dozens of cruisers and destroyers. This overwhelming force could still bombard Midway into rubble and perhaps salvage something from the wreckage of Operation Me. But Yamamoto was too experienced a strategist to chase after a victory that no longer existed. Without carrier-based air cover, his battleships would be sitting ducks for American land-based bombers. The element of surprise was gone, and with it, any hope of decisive success. Captain Kameto Kurashima, Yamamoto's chief of staff, approached cautiously. "Admiral, the fleet commanders are requesting instructions. Do we proceed with the bombardment?" Yamamoto remained silent for long minutes, staring out at the darkening Pacific. Finally, he spoke in a voice that seemed to carry the weight of Japan's future. "Signal all units. Operation Me is cancelled. We are withdrawing." The order sent shockwaves through the Japanese fleet. Rear Admiral Hiroaki Abe, commanding the vanguard of battleships and cruisers, could hardly believe the transmission. His forces were less than 300 miles from Midway, well within striking range of the American base. But Yamamoto's wisdom would be vindicated by subsequent events. Even as the Japanese fleet began its melancholy retreat westward, American submarines were converging on the area. The USS Nautilus, the same submarine that had been depth-charged by the destroyer Arashi earlier that morning, was already stalking the damaged Japanese carriers. Lieutenant Commander William Brockman maneuvered his submarine through the screening destroyers and fired a spread of torpedoes at the abandoned carrier Kaga. Though his attack was unsuccessful, it demonstrated how vulnerable the Japanese fleet had become without air cover. As documented in Japanese Naval General Staff records, the retreat from Midway marked a fundamental shift in Japanese strategic thinking. The myth of invincibility that had sustained their rapid expansion across the Pacific was shattered. From this moment forward, Japan would be fighting a defensive war against increasingly superior American forces. The human cost of the battle was staggering for both sides, but fell disproportionately on the Japanese. Over 3,000 Japanese sailors and airmen had been killed or wounded, including many of their most experienced carrier pilots, men who had trained for years and could not be quickly replaced. The Americans had lost 307 men, including the heroic torpedo bomber crews, who had sacrificed themselves to draw down the Japanese fighter cover. Captain Richard Fleming of the Marine Corps, flying an obsolete Vindicator dive bomber from Midway, made the last American attack of the day against the heavy cruiser Mikuma. Fleming's aircraft, already damaged by anti-aircraft fire, crashed into the cruisers after turret in what may have been a deliberate ramming attack. The explosion and resulting fires would eventually sink the ship. As night fell on June 4th, the magnitude of the American victory became clear. In a single day, the United States Navy had reversed the tide of war in the Pacific. The Japanese fleet that had seemed unstoppable 6 months earlier was now in full retreat, its carrier force decimated, and its aura of invincibility permanently shattered. Admiral Nimitz, receiving reports of the victory at Pearl Harbor, allowed himself a rare smile. The codebreakers had been proven right. The trap had worked perfectly. And American naval aviation had demonstrated its superiority over the previously dominant Japanese fleet. The long road to Tokyo had begun at Midway. The abandoned Japanese carrier Hiryu burned through the night of June 4th, her hull glowing like a beacon on the dark Pacific. At dawn on June 5th, Captain Tomio Kaku made his final decision. Rather than allow his ship to be captured or salvaged, he ordered the destroyer, Makigumo, to sink Hiryu with torpedoes. The last of Admiral Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers slipped beneath the waves at 9:10 a.m., taking with her the dreams of Japanese Pacific dominance. 200 miles to the northeast, the crippled Yorktown presented a different kind of tragedy. Captain Elliot Buckmaster had ordered his crew to abandon ship the previous afternoon, but the tough carrier refused to sink. Throughout the night, damage control parties had worked to save her, and by morning it appeared the ship might yet survive. Commander Clarence Aldrich led a skeleton crew back aboard Yorktown at daybreak, hoping to get the carrier under tow back to Pearl Harbor. The salvage operation proceeded smoothly until 1:30 p.m., when lookouts spotted torpedo wakes approaching through the water. The Japanese submarine, I-168, commanded by Lieutenant Commander Jahachi Tanabe, had been stalking the damaged American carrier since the previous evening. Despite the protective screen of destroyers, Tanabe had maneuvered into attack position and fired 4 torpedoes at the stationary target. 2 torpedoes struck Yorktown amidships, the explosions tearing massive holes in her already weakened hull. The 3rd torpedo found an even more valuable target, the destroyer Hammond, which was tied alongside providing power and pumping services. The small warship broke in half and sank within minutes, taking 81 of her crew with her. Yorktown lingered until the morning of June 7th, when she finally rolled over and sank in 3,000 fathoms of water. Her loss was mourning throughout the American fleet, but it could not diminish the magnitude of the victory achieved at Midway. According to post-war Japanese naval archives, the Battle of Midway marked the beginning of Japan's terminal decline as a naval power. The loss of 4 fleet carriers was catastrophic enough, but the destruction of their experienced air crews was even more devastating. Japan had begun the war with fewer than 500 trained carrier pilots, and nearly half of them had been killed or wounded in the Coral Sea and Midway campaigns. The strategic implications of the American victory extended far beyond the immediate battle damage. Japan's offensive capability in the Pacific was effectively ended. No longer could they launch major amphibious operations against Allied positions. Instead, they would be forced into an increasingly desperate defensive posture. As American industrial production reached full wartime capacity, Admiral King's assessment to President Roosevelt captured the significance perfectly. Midway was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. From this moment forward, we hold the initiative. The ripple effects of the victory spread quickly throughout the Pacific theater. Australian Prime Minister John Curtin, who had feared imminent invasion just days earlier, announced to his parliament that the immediate threat to Australia had passed. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding Allied forces in the Southwest Pacific, began planning offensive operations that would have been impossible before Midway. The Japanese government attempted to conceal the magnitude of their defeat from their own people. Radio Tokyo announced a great victory at Midway, claiming that 2 American carriers had been sunk, while Japanese losses were minimal. This propaganda would be maintained for months, preventing the Japanese public from understanding how drastically their strategic position had deteriorated. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of both Pearl Harbor and the Midway disaster, drew the inevitable conclusion from the battle's outcome. In a private letter to a colleague, he wrote, "I fear we have awakened a sleeping giant and filled him with terrible resolve." The same strategic insight that had made him oppose war with America now told him that Japan could not win a prolonged conflict against American industrial might. The Battle of Midway had lasted just 4 days, but its consequences would echo throughout the remainder of World War II. American forces would go on the offensive within months. Beginning with the invasion of Guadalcanal in August 1942, the island-hopping campaign that would eventually bring Allied forces to Japan's doorstep had become possible because of the victory won by American codebreakers, pilots and sailors in the waters around a tiny Pacific atoll. The young nation that had been surprised at Pearl Harbor had delivered a devastating counterpunch at Midway, proving that American resolve and ingenuity could overcome even the most carefully planned enemy strategy. The tide of war in the Pacific had turned forever.